We have Keith Stewart, coordinator of the Climate Energy Campaign at Greenpeace. He's also part-time faculty at the U of D. He's been a long-time writer on energy policy. He's one of the first people I met when I moved to Toronto in 1990. And we started hanging out. He was one of my students for a period. And we formed in those days an eco-socialist group, if you remember. A lot of fun. So I'm very pleased that Keith's here.
Thanks so much for having me. Delightful to be here, and it's great to have such a large crowd. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of New Credit. I also wanted to acknowledge that over the last kind of 5 or 6 years working on tar sands, I've learned a lot from some of my colleagues who are Indigenous campaigners or working for their First Nation, people like Melina Labukan Massimo, who I've worked with for a number of years now, works at Greenpeace, Shaman Sotswahani, who's also working with us, but also folks like Ariel Deranger from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and then Clay and Heather from the Indigenous Tar Sands Campaign. So there's a lot of people who knows better than me, but it would have been a large carbon debt to bring them all here. So you get me instead. So I was asked to talk about what goes on in the tar sands, the actual extraction process, the tailings ponds, the climate impact. So I thought I'd break this into 2 sections. The first section is on the physical aspects, what ecologically, what's actually like happening literally on the ground or sometimes under it. But then also talk about the politics of the union of oil and state in this country, because the two are inextricably intertwined. So first, the physical aspects. One way to understand the modern oil company is it's a vast apparatus for taking carbon out of the ground and putting it into the atmosphere. That is their basic business model. And that's a problem if you take climate change seriously. I meet with a bunch of oil executives. Oddly enough, I meet with more oil executives working at Greenpeace than I do with government officials, but because the oil guys will talk to us. But we'll sort of have a conversation. They're basically, what would it take to make you go away? We're saying, well, we want you to change what your business is from being an oil company to being something else. And then they call for the check. But in the tar sands, the extraction process, there's 2 main ways. The first is the older system, it's strip mining. You start with a boreal forest, something that looks a lot like that. And it's a living, thriving ecosystem. It's home to a variety of animals and plants. That wolf print is from the area which Shell wants to turn into the Pierre River mine. You also have human communities. That's my colleague Melina, her dad. They're from the Lubicon Cree, and she's actually got a chapter in the book that Greg mentioned. Now, those communities, the animals, the plants, and the human communities are what the industry refers to as overburden. Stuff that is in the way. And so how you deal with overburden is, first of all, you cut it all down, then you dig it up, and then you throw it all away so you can get at the bitumen underneath. This is not the kind of oil, I don't know, most of you probably didn't watch Beverly Hillbillies when you were kids, but the idea that you would, like just puncture a hole in the ground and the oil would come spurting out, well, this isn't like that. Bitumen is basically a solid at room temperature. Or as the industry likes to say, it's as hard as a hockey puck. And the way you get it, the tar-like substance that's mixed up with the clay and the soil, is you basically have to use a vast amount of water and a vast amount of energy to melt it out of the ground. Which is why this is so energy intensive. So you have operations which look like this. So you dig the bitumen up, you carry it off, you add it with a bunch of water, you oil the whole thing up, then you have to do something with the water. Well, you create these things that are called tailings ponds. The industry calls them tailings ponds. They're actually poisonous lakes. They currently cover 140 square kilometers in northern Alberta. The second largest dam in the entire world The Three Gorges Dam is the largest in China. The second largest dam in the entire world is in northern Alberta. It's made entirely out of dirt. And it holds back this kind of stuff from the Athabasca River. The river runs right along the edge of it. The thing when you build a dam out of dirt and you don't line the bottom of these lakes is they do this thing which the technical term for is they leak. The industry denies it. They say that any contamination in the water comes from naturally occurring bitumen, but oddly enough, the contamination levels are much, much higher downstream of these operations than upstream of them. So, you have this toxic stuff that's all left behind. And it gets into the water, where it gets into the fish, where it then gets into the people. And so for communities in that area, you either have to choose with, if you're living off the land, accept that there's going to be a whole bunch of toxins coming into your body, which is why we have elevated levels of certain types of cancer in places like Fort Chipewyan. Or you have to give up your traditional way of life, which is in fact, as Heather will go into more detail on, a violation of a constitutional right in Canada for First Nations and Indigenous people to hunt, fish, and trap. And that's the choice the communities face. Sorry, it's not, because they don't currently have a choice to say no. Although, legally, we're working on strategies to make that happen. Newer tar sands operations are what the industry calls in situ, in place or underground. They don't dig it all up. What they do is they inject high-pressure stream underneath. They don't look as ugly. That doesn't look as nasty as a open-pit mine. But all of the pipelines and roads you have to cut for this fragment habitat. So, for instance, wolves can get at caribou. The caribou are being extirpated, which means locally extinct in that area. The solution to this, which we have come up with as a society, is to pay people to fly around in helicopters and shoot the wolves with high-powered rifles to try and protect the caribou, rather than try and protect the actual habitat. Not a great solution. The underground operations, however, actually use a lot more energy than the open pit. So there's more greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. And the industry likes to boast about how their emissions per barrel have gone down since 1990, but they're going back up now. Because they've used up all the easiest bitumen to get at, and they now have to go after much harder stuff, which requires more energy, more water, more work, more disruption. Now the tar sands, right now there's 2 million barrels per day worth of production. It's been rising incredibly quickly. The governments have actually handed out permits to take that to 5 million barrels per day. So from 2 million to 5 million barrels per day, they have every permit they need. And somewhere in the permitting process is another 4 million barrels per day. So industry wants to take it from 2 million to 9 million barrels per day. This would have enormous implications. And tar sands, oil and gas, as of 2012, became the largest industrial sector, like the upstream oil and gas industry, not burning it in your cars, but just getting it out of the ground, is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, more than all the tailpipes in the country, more than all the electricity plants. And the tar sands are the fastest rising source by far. And this chart's showing that, by 2020, the oil sands are actually probably by about 2017. The oil sands will, on their own, just getting the stuff out of the ground and to a refinery, will have higher greenhouse gas emissions than all but 2 provinces. So if we want to do anything about greenhouse gas emissions in this country, you have to deal with that little gray spike going up. There's no way to get around that. Which brings us to the political elements. You may have noticed that our Prime Minister likes to make most of his important policy announcements outside of the country. Or actually, he did his big one, I guess, on Friday in Mississauga. Rather than in, say, the House of Commons. But it's worth noting that his very first speech as Prime Minister outside of Canada was to a business audience in the UK, where he announced in back in July 2006 that Canada was an emerging energy superpower. If you've read Paul Well's history of Stephen Harper, one of the most interesting little tidbits in it is, Stephen Harper goes through his speeches and takes out all the interesting bits to make them boring. It's a strategy. He wants to be bland, except in rare moments, like, for instance, yesterday, where he wants to, have the big quotes. But he's not a man given to poetry. But back in 2006, when he was describing his energy superpower vision, these are his words. An ocean of oil-soaked sand lies under the muskeg of northern Alberta, my home province. Not his home province, by the way. The oil sands are the second largest oil deposit in the world, bigger than Iraq, Iran, or Russia, exceeded only by Saudi Arabia. Digging the bitumen out of the ground, squeezing out the oil, and converting it into synthetic crude is a monumental challenge. It requires vast amounts of capital, Brobdingnagian technology, that's from Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, I had to look it up. It means very big. Brobdingnagian technology, and an army of skilled workers. In short, it is an enterprise of epic proportions, akin to the building of the pyramids or China's Great Wall, only bigger. And this is his vision of Canada.
Only bigger.
It is to take that army of skilled workers and put them to work, turning Canada into a superpower. We get to swagger around with the big boys. It's not just Stephen Harper, however. On the day that he launched his leadership bid, Justin Trudeau flew to Calgary and told the assembled oil executives that he understood. Quote, "It is time to be more honest with ourselves. There is not a country in the world that would find 170 billion barrels of oil and leave it in the ground." That's our great hope. However, leaving the oil, and particularly the oil sands or tar sands, whichever one you want to call it, in the ground is precisely what we have to do if we're going to do something about climate change. The not particularly tree-hugging types over at the International Energy Agency say we need to leave 2/3 of fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're going to keep warming below 2 degrees. According to a study published this month in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious academic journals on the planet, there is only a negligible role for tar sands in the global energy system post-2020 if we want to keep warming below internationally agreed upon goal of 2 degrees Celsius. So if we are really serious with ourselves, we have to recognize that that dream of becoming an energy superpower, rooted in the tar sands, is one that can only be realized in a world where we fail to limit carbon pollution so that climate change is spinning out of control. John Holdren, scientific advisor to Barack Obama, likes to say, there's 3 things we can and will do about climate change. First, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that the problem isn't as bad. Secondly, we can adapt, change the way we build our cities and our communities so that when the big storms come, they don't flood everything, or they flood less. So you can mitigate, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, adapt, and 3 is suffer. And by choosing an economic strategy where we don't reduce, and in fact grow greenhouse gas emissions, we're not really doing adaptation, we're choosing to maximize suffering. And the suffering is going to hit hardest at those who've done the least to cause this problems. People in the global south, but also here in Canada, it'll be primarily poor Canadians, and particularly in many parts of the world, of this country, First Nations, who will be facing those flooded homes, dealing with the superstorms. This is a world where drought destroys crops, so food prices go up, polar ice cap disappears. The Harper government has been unwavering, one could even use the word ruthless, in the pursuit of this vision of an energy superpower Canada. They've muzzled government scientists, gutted environmental laws, eliminated climate research agencies, reneged on our international climate commitments, and labeled those standing up for a cleaner environment as radicals, criminals, and traitors. Oh, I forgot, money launderers. We're money launderers too. So they basically tried to bulldoze their opposition, treated their opposition as overburden. Something that has to, this sort of democratic debate, discussion, all has to be freed up, has to be plowed away so that we can let money and power do their thing. The interesting thing, however, is that they have failed. I mean, the tar sands are continuing to grow, but they are running into some big problems. In British Columbia, they've hit an unbroken wall of opposition to tar sands from First Nations. There's over 100 First Nations which have said no, supported by environmentalists and workers throughout the province. The Northern Gateway Pipeline is basically politically dead. It's tied up in court cases, but Enbridge knows that even though they have all the government permissions they need, they cannot build that pipeline. Further south in the southern pipeline through BC, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, is also facing really strong opposition. And you can see in those pictures there's First Nations out traditional canoes to sort of express their opposition. And over here that's Ta'a, she's an elder from the Tsleil-Waututh, who's told her people they have to warrior up and stop this. And then in December, we were treated to over 120 people being arrested to block survey work by Kinder Morgan pipelines. And then they all had their charges thrown out because Kinder Morgan apparently can't do GPS right, and they were arresting people in the wrong place. And of course, south of the border, the Keystone Pipeline has re-energized the US environmental movement and convinced large portions of that movement that they need to stop trying to put on suits and negotiate inside the Beltway and actually get out into the streets. You can see, there's the one beside the bulldozers from the tar sands blockade down in Texas. People in Texas getting arrested to stop a pipeline. That's James Hansen, probably the most famous climate scientist in the world, getting arrested in front of the White House. This has been, Congress is going to pass legislation authorizing it, and Obama's going to veto it. It's the first time. We're going to have to get the pressure on to make sure he keeps vetoing it. These struggles over pipelines, if you read the press, all the very important people who write opinion pieces, they all say this is theater and sideshow and it's not important. But it actually is vital for two reasons, I think. First of all, it shows that people power can actually beat the fossil fuel industry and all their money. We've held them to a draw, and in many ways we're winning. And these are basically what Bill McKibben calls the wealthiest corporations in the history of money. But it also matters because we are landlocking that resource. As I said, they've handed out permits to take production to $5 million. In the tar sands, this chart is showing, this is actually out of the western, basically out of Alberta and North Dakota, all the oil that comes out of there. The green is existing pipelines, and then the orange stuff is all pipelines that haven't been built yet. And what you see is, pretty soon they run out of pipelines. They don't need Keystone or Gateway or Kinder Morgan or Energy East to actually increase production they want. They actually need every one of those pipelines and more. And all the rail that they can do. So this is what the Minister of Energy in Alberta calls being landlocked in bitumen. It terrifies them. They complain that it costs them $50 million a day. It's not really that much. So it's probably only $25 or $30 million a day. So it's costing the oil industry these pipeline fights. But this is actually effective. And that's one of the reasons why they keep telling us over and over again that we should stop doing it. This struggle has been led by First Nations in Canada and the US. That's Crystal Lehman from the Cold Lake region speaking to 50,000 people down in Washington. Melina to one side of her, and I'm now blocking on the name of the third person, it'll come back to me. But whether it's in Washington, whether it's in Victoria, the Defend Our Coast protests, where there was very clear evidence from all the when the First Nations came marching in, it was kind of like the government knew they were in big trouble. In Ottawa, it's been led by First Nations because they have a particular connection to the land. They also have constitutional rights which give them legal founding to be able to challenge these decisions in a way that, for instance, Greenpeace cannot. Stephen Harper can change the environmental laws to ease approval of pipelines. He can't change the Constitution. And this is a big problem for them. At Greenpeace, we're trying to learn how to be a better ally as an organization. In BC, it's what they call the two canoes model. First Nations and environmental groups, we're going in the same direction, we're helping each other out along the way, sharing resources, but we're not actually in the same canoe. We don't have exactly the same, we organize ourselves differently, we have internal decision making that's very different, we operate on different kinds of timelines. Environmental groups want to do everything right now. First Nations are generally thinking in terms of more in terms of generations. But that support back and forth, I think, has been a really rich source of effective resistance. One of the things, however, that one of Greenpeace's big focuses on, and I think it's something we can add to this, is what we call separate oil and state. We want to expose, name, and shame, basically, how big oil is in bed with our governments, and whose interests are being served by that. So I'm going to turn it over now to Heather, but looking forward to questions.